Welcome to the Soapbox, folks. My name is Russell Conte. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to do the chest pocket for a jacket. So without further ado, let's get right to it. First things first, I need to give credit where credit is due, and this credit goes to Robert Cabrera. He wrote the book Classic Tailoring Techniques for Menswear, and this instruction is taken directly from that book with a couple modifications. What you'll find in the tailoring world is there are a lot of different ways to do exactly the same thing, and this is one of several methods that I think are pretty successful, so I thought I'd share that with you. The first thing we want to do in preparation for our welt pocket is cut a piece of fusible woven interfacing. I've prepped it here already. We're going to cut it 1 3/8 inches in height. We're going to cut it 4 1/2 inches in width, and then 3/8 of an inch from this edge at the bottom. We're going to trace a line on the non-glue side of it. Once you've done that, you're going to go ahead and cut a wedge from this side that starts at 0 and goes to 1/4 inch, and on the right side you're going to cut from 1/4 inch to 0 for that wedge. And you'll notice I have a little notch at the bottom here. I simply do that so that I remember which portion goes to the center front of my garment, so you'll see that on all my pieces. Once we prepared our interfacing, we're going to go ahead and cut our self for the welt. And face down in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to place the fusible on the back side of it, and we want that welt piece of self to be 3/8 of an inch wider on both sides, 5/8 of an inch higher or taller than the top. And then your fusible is just going to get placed there, and we'll glue it to the back side of the self. So it's going to look like this. We also need to support the pocket opening, and some people put a fusible there. In this case, the instructions indicate taking a piece of pocketing cut on grain, and then we're going to cut it 2 inches wide by about 6 inches in length. We also need to cut 2 pocket bags. The instructions indicate cutting 2 squares 6 inches by 6 inches, and that works quite successfully. Where I digress from the instructions is that they indicate also to cut a wedge, and they want you to start at 0 and go to 1/2 inch. I actually found it more successful if I went from 0 to 3/4 of an inch. I kept the line of the pocket in a better place for me. Finally, if you're doing this as a sample piece, you just need to pack a piece of fabric that's going to act as your jacket back. So I cut a piece that's 8 inches in square, and then I just indicate where my pocket placement is going. So I marked it with chalk, and I've also marked the back so I know where that is. And then I put an X on the back just so I remember that this is the wrong side of the fabric, okay, or the reverse. Again, you'll notice that I have that little notch cut out of myself, just so I remember what goes to the center front of the garment. Now we're ready for construction. Once you've placed the fusible interfacing to the back side of the self that we're using for the welt, we're going to go ahead and retrieve one of the pocket pouch pieces, and we're going to align these face down, equidistant on both ends. You're simply going to sew this at 1/4 inch from end to end, back stitch at both places, and we're going to press the seam allowance open. I've sewn the welt to the pocketing. I've pressed the seam allowance open. The next step is we're going to fold the welt into place so that the interfacing sits right at the top, like that. And then the intention is to sew from this point here, following the edge of the interfacing, down to the line. We'll do the same thing on this side. However, when you do that, what you want to do is you want to force them to the center, about 1/8 of an inch, just to create a little bit of a bubble. What that's going to do is once we turn this to the face side, it's going to make all the fabrics wrap to the back along the lining portion. Now, make another little adjustment from the instruction that Roberto provides us. And what I do here is I sew here, and then I back stitch at the line, and then I just go ahead and sew the balance. I sew here, and where my line is indicated, I'm going to back stitch there and sew this. Eventually we will take out this stitching right here to the line on both sides, and I find by back stitching right there it just keeps it more stable. So I've sewn here, I back stitched at the line, then I sewed down, and then I press this over just so we have a little bit of a bubble again there. Sew down along the edge, back stitch, sew down the edge. Now the next step is to clip all this excess fabric out of the way. So right at the bottom of the welt, the cut edge of it, we're going to cut right to the stitching, but not through it. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to take some of the bulk out of here. So that's what we have so far right there. Now we're going to go ahead and notch this out as well to reduce some more bulk. We'll do some at the top as well. Okay, so again we have a cut line, that matches here at the cut line, clip to the stitches but not through them, then go ahead and notch out that corner and notch out that corner. We'll do exactly the same thing over here. Clip to the stitches but not through them. Take the additional bulk out. Clip the corner. Clip the corner. And now we're ready for pressing. To successfully press the welt, we need a tailor's anvil, sometimes just referred to as a tailor board. And we want to get in here, place it on the board, and with the toe of the iron, press those seam allowances open. Once they're pressed open, we're ready to turn to the face side. Now that the ends of the welt have been pressed open, we're ready to turn it face out. Go ahead and turn it around. Lift those corners out. There we are. Once the welt's been turned to the face side, you can give it a nice press. You can see that it's a little larger here. And again, the point of that when we did that little bubble was simply so that there'd be more of the self that would wrap to the back and kind of help us to hide the lining portion of it. Now, once it's in this position, we want to open this back up and we're going to remove those stitches up to the sewing line. So that little drawn line that we made before, we want to remove to that point. And that's why I like to backstitch to that point, because it makes it more successful. Same thing here, we'll remove those. And then we're ready for the rest of our assembly. Now that our welt is prepared, here's where the magic begins. We're going to fold the pocketing out of the way and the welt back on itself, and that's going to reveal that line that we drew, and that's going to be our sewing line now, and that's why we remove those stitches at the ends of the welt. We're to place it on our jacket. Make certain it's in the correct position. We want the lines to align as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew from end to end, backstitching at both ends. Be certain that you don't sew beyond the end, so you just want one stitch off the end and backstitch, one stitch off the end and backstitch. Once we've done that, we're ready for the next step. I've sewn the welt into place, backstitched at both ends. Now we've got another couple of steps here, and what I suggest doing at this point is clipping the corners of that cut edge right there. I'll explain in a moment why. There we go. What we're going to do is we're going to place the other pocketing into place. It's going to nest right in here, so we want to sandwich it right underneath where that seam allowance is. So where we have the sewing line and we've got the raw edge of the welt that we were working with, we're just going to nestle that other pocketing right underneath there. Once we've done that, we're going to sew from this point to that point. So use the notches as your guide, because we want to be about 1/4 inch inside of our prior stitching line, here and here. So we're going to start here, backstitch, we'll end over here and backstitch. You're using this as your guide for sewing, but you're not going to sew this, so make certain this remains free. Okay? And the reason we want to make certain we don't go beyond these ends here, about 1/4 inch in from the ends that we sewed before, is that eventually the welt is going to fold up into place. And if we sew all the way out parallel to the edge and match our prior stitching, it's likely that the opening of the pocket will show. So we want to just taper that inside pocketing opening ever so slightly at the top. So again, what we're doing is we're lifting up this fabric right here, the seam allowance. We're nudging the other fabric into place for the pocketing, just lining it up there. And then we're going to sew from notch to notch, backstitching at both ends, using the edge, the cut line as our guide, making certain not to sew that piece of fabric from the welt. Now I've sewn the other piece of pocketing into place, using the ends as my guide, backstitches at both ends. That edge is free, and you can see where my sewing line is. Now I'm going to flip it over, and just like a regular welt pocket, I'm going to clip right between, and 1/4 inch in from the ends of the short side, I'm going to clip up to the stitches but not through, clip up to the stitches but not through, and the same thing down here. I'm going to do the same thing all the way out this direction. I've sewn my back pocketing piece into place using the edge of the welt cut line as my guide, starting here, ending here, backstitching at both ends, not capturing that fold of fabric. Okay. I've turned it over, I've cut right through the center like I would with a regular welt pocket, and I clipped up to the stitches and down to the stitches but not through them on both ends. Once we've done that, we're ready for pressing. What we're going to do is we're going to bring the back pocketing to the inside. We want to keep those seam allowances at the top pressed toward the pocketing portion, so into the pocket. This is where it gets a little complicated, and it's not hard, it's just odd. What we're going to do is we're going to take the welt and the pocketing to the inside as well. So everything is kind of in place now. But if you feel here, you can actually feel quite a bit of bulk, and there's a little pleat here at the edges. The way we're going to resolve that is we're going to turn this over, move the back pocketing out of the way, move the front pocketing out of the way, and that's going to reveal the seam allowance that we had earlier for the welt. And what we want to do is there's a little pocket in here, right where the welt is. It's still open. We're going to take that seam allowance and we're going to press it open. And that will reduce all that bulk so that the seam allowance for the cut line goes up into the welt, and then we have the other seam allowance going down into the body of the garment. My welt is all pressed into place. And again, we have the seam allowance opened here and pressed up into the welt and then down toward the jacket. The seam allowance at the top is pressed toward the pocketing. And then also what I want to bring out to your attention is right here, the triangles of the welt when you clip them at the ends. Sometimes people like to turn those back and sew them into place. I leave them just as they are here. It reduces bulk, and we're going to actually hand stitch the ends closed anyway, and even if we machine stitch them, they would be held stable. So it helps reduce the bulk and gives it a cleaner finish. Now at this point what we're going to do is we're going to base the top of the pocket into place, and then we're going to come back through and we're going to sew our seam allowance 1/2 inch all the way around the pocket itself to close the bag, and then we're going to come back in and finish sewing the welt to the jacket. I've basted the upper edge of my welt in place. I've sewn the edges of my pocket. I've trimmed away the excess, and then we're ready for attaching the welt to the jacket. What we're going to do is just take a diagonal stitch right here on the edges. So think of it kind of like a whip stitch. What we want to do is we want to come through and capture the welt and the pocketing from the back, but we don't want it to be visible from the front. I find a back stitch works pretty successfully here. So I come through, make certain I'm capturing the front without coming through. And I'm going to back stitch. So I do this each time I go up, and go up about 1/4 inch to take another stitch. And again, we're capturing the welt from behind, so you're capturing the lining portion. We don't want it to come through the front. And then back stitch. You'll do this all the way up and then all the way back down on both sides. I've back stitched through all layers, capturing the welt as I come up the sides on both sides. It's all anchored there, and we are complete with our welt pocket. Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm Russell Conte with the Soapbox. Should you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to help in any way I can. In the meantime, have a great day sewing.